This is a story from Last One to Die called Roosevelt. Over the past few years, I've thought about Wayside Correctional Facility and some of the characters I met there. As I was preparing to write a story for my column one evening, I found a post-it note on my desk. My desk is made out of an old door that had a single line, Roosevelt at Wayside. I would often scribble ideas for future stories down on scratch paper as a means of avoiding dreaded writer's block. To you, that means nothing. To me, it puts me back almost a decade and a half. Let me clue you in. More than a dozen years ago, before marriage, before the birth of my son, etc., I found myself in some trouble, warrants, etc. And I was sentenced to Camp Wayside, out by Magic Mountain, for approximately 1/3 of a year. I spent a night or two in Van Nuys, then court, then a week or two in Los Angeles County, then home sweet home, Camp Wayside. It was during one of the hottest summers known to man, or at least to me, that I met a black guy named Roosevelt. When he was first processed through, Roosevelt was a wreck. He had been a crack addict for years and years. Because of the way he looked, there was no way to gauge Roosevelt's age. Maybe 60, maybe 25, who knows? The weird thing is, everyone knew him, and I mean everybody, but no one knew his whole name, just Roosevelt. I never heard if that was his first name or his last name, just Roosevelt. Within a couple of days, the black barber at the time snuck Roosevelt into the barber shop and gave him an extreme makeover. Trimmed the beard, cut his nails, cut his hair. All the barber shops had nail clippers, which couldn't be in the general population. So, as Roosevelt got his hair cut, he trimmed his long dragon-like finger and toenails. By the time he walked out of there, he looked like an attorney visiting an inmate, not the inmate. The 100 days that I spent with Roosevelt was always entertaining. Because Roosevelt didn't have access to crack, he developed a horrid addiction to caffeine. And because he was picked up off the streets, he had no money on his books. So he was always looking for some coffee from somebody. Coffee was bought from the machines or the once-a-week store. But it wasn't like we buy coffee. It was purchased as tea bags for 25 cents each. I've always been a major coffee fiend, drinking it heavily since high school, so I'd stock up, buying $5 worth at a time. Then I'd kick down a bag a day to Roosevelt. One day, one of the guys in my barrack needed a haircut. I was the white barber. Because he was going to get a visit from his fiancée, he wanted to look sharp. I cut his hair and shaved him with the edger. He didn't have any money on his books. No worries, just pay it forward. He said he'd hook me up tomorrow. The next day, during his shift in the office, he nabbed a half a pound of coffee, grounds from the sheriff's stash. This was like gold. The next night, while everyone was asleep, Roosevelt came fluttering into my barrack like a bat, while the rest of the camp was asleep. Roosevelt never slept more than 3 hours a day. He starts smacking my foot. Homeboy, you awake? Homeboy, you got coffee? I was half expecting him, but more around daylight hours. I reached into my bag and handed him the coffee grounds, which you could put into a sock and dip into hot water, and you got coffee much better than the tea bag shit. He looked at the grounds, then he looked up at me. Thanks, I love you, homeboy, and then fluttered off again. The next day at lunch, I overheard a sheriff saying that Roosevelt was a genius as a child, that he started taking classes at UCLA at 12 years old, and had an incredible understanding and/or grasp of quantum physics. I never saw this side of Roosevelt. The Roosevelt I knew was always on the go, looking for his caffeine fix. One afternoon, everybody, except for the sheriffs, were put on alert because of the South Side car was planning on making some pruno and inside of the walls of the camp, that meant drunken gang members, which led to riots usually. Roosevelt heard about the pruno making and decided to worm his way up into the party. I saw him 2 hours later, visibly drunk, but trying to explain to me why Star Trek was full of shit. Motherfucking Captain Kirk beamed me up, Scotty. His weight in the 60s, you couldn't transport him. I could have made him disappear, but transport? Bullshit. Now I'll transport a motherfucker back, then bullshit. I listened. He was laughing his ass off. I smiled, but was clueless. But the more he laughed, the more the sheriff started looking. So I pulled him into the barber shop and gave him a #2 attachment on his head and beard and let him hang out in the shop until he was somewhat sober. At the end of those 100 days with him, I said goodbye to a couple of people, and then Roosevelt came by and looked very sad. Or was it friendship? Or was it the coffee connection? The other two barbers, Hispanic and black, promised to foot him his caffeine addiction. It's been more than a quarter of my life since I was back in Wayside, but occasionally I remember some of the characters I met there. But now it's like somebody else's life I'm watching, like a strange Quentin Tarantino movie playing out in my head. People you wouldn't notice on the street become your temporary friends for a brief moment in time. Thank you for listening. And that was from Last One to Die.